Why does God allow Satan to act? At first glance, this question sounds almost innocent, like a child asking why darkness exists at night. But the moment it is asked seriously, it begins to shake the entire architecture of belief. Because this question does not merely target Satan, it interrogates God. If God is all-powerful and perfectly good, why does he allow evil to operate freely in the world? If he permits it, is this permission a sign of weakness, or is it something far more unsettling, a conscious decision? Traditional religious answers tend to rush in at this point. Humanity is being tested, they say. Yet the idea of a test implies uncertainty. A test assumes the examiner does not fully know the outcome. Does God not know? If he does know, then why test at all? This is where theology begins to unravel into philosophy. Perhaps the real issue is not what Satan does, but what God chooses not to do. And perhaps this absence of intervention is not passive negligence, but deliberate restraint. We will return to this idea shortly, because it changes everything about how we understand evil, responsibility, and divine authority. Satan is often portrayed as a rebellious error, a creature who stepped out of line and broke the harmony of creation. But this framing ignores a crucial detail. Was Satan created with the capacity to rebel, or did that capacity emerge accidentally? If God did not foresee Satan's rebellion, then the idea of divine omniscience collapses. But if God did foresee it and created Satan anyway, then Satan ceases to be a cosmic mistake and becomes something else entirely, a function. Functions are not external to systems. They are necessary for systems to operate. From this perspective, Satan's existence is not a flaw in creation, but a structural element of it. This leads to an uncomfortable distinction between permission and approval. God may not endorse Satan's actions, but he allows them to unfold. And allowance, especially when it comes from an all-powerful being, is never neutral. The question then becomes, are there real limits to Satan's actions? Or are those limits merely psychological boundaries humans draw to preserve their sense of moral order? When we later examine free will more closely, we will see just how fragile those boundaries truly are. For now, let us leave this question suspended. If Satan is truly unwanted by God, why does he remain on the stage of existence? The concept most commonly used to justify God's tolerance of Satan is free will. Humans are free, therefore evil exists. Satan in this narrative is merely the catalyst. On the surface, this explanation feels satisfying, but when examined carefully, it begins to fracture. Free will requires choice, and choice requires alternatives. The existence of alternatives means that evil cannot be completely removed from the system. Did God not know this when he granted free will? If he did, then evil was the price he willingly paid for freedom. And if that is the case, then evil is not an accident. It is embedded in the design. At this point, Satan starts to look less like an enemy and more like a balancing force. Does goodness retain meaning in the absence of evil? This question is deeply disturbing because it suggests that God may be dependent on his opposite to define himself. But perhaps the real mistake lies in projecting human ideas of moral absolutism onto something that may transcend them. Shortly, we will explore how this projection collapses and why Satan consistently appears in religious narratives as a necessary adversary rather than a disposable villain. God's silence is often more powerful than his intervention. Throughout history, through wars, genocides, natural disasters, and personal suffering, God's absence has spoken louder than any miracle ever could. Believers attempt to fill this silence with concepts like destiny, divine wisdom, or an unknowable plan. Yet every unanswered prayer leaves behind a residue of doubt. Suppressed questions do not disappear, they accumulate. In this context, Satan becomes more than the agent of evil. He becomes the mirror that reflects God's silence back at humanity. Without Satan, would divine justice ever be questioned? This is where the discussion becomes truly dangerous, because it leads us to consider that the relationship between God and Satan may not be one of simple opposition. It may be a relationship of mutual definition. In the second half of this exploration, we will confront the possibility that Satan is not acting against God's will, but within it. Before we go there, however, we must first examine whether Satan is truly free, and what that implies about God's role in this cosmic structure. If Satan is free, then God is not in full control. If Satan is not free, then God is fully responsible. There is no third option, and this is where most theological systems quietly look away, because either possibility destabilizes the image of an all-good, all-powerful deity. If Satan acts independently, then God's sovereignty is limited. If Satan acts within limits set by God, then evil operates under divine authorization. This paradox is not a modern invention. It appears implicitly in ancient texts where Satan is not an external invader, but a figure allowed to roam, question, accuse, and test. In some traditions, Satan does not even tempt on his own initiative. He tests when permitted. This detail matters more than believers often realize. It suggests that Satan is not chaos unleashed, but chaos regulated. And regulated chaos is not rebellion, it is administration. We will soon confront the unsettling idea that Satan may function less like an enemy general and more like an inspector, one who exposes weakness rather than creates it. This reframing forces us to revisit the concept of moral responsibility. When humans commit atrocities, religious narratives often attribute temptation to Satan, yet punishment falls entirely on humanity. Why is the tempter not held accountable to the same degree as the tempted? The usual answer is that temptation does not remove choice. But then what is Satan's role if not to introduce imbalance? A system that introduces imbalance and then punishes those who fall into it raises ethical concerns. This is not merely a philosophical exercise, it is a question of justice. If God allows Satan to push humanity toward failure, knowing full well the consequences, then divine judgment begins to resemble entrapment rather than fairness. At this point, believers often retreat into mystery. God's ways are higher. But mystery is not an answer, it is a shield. And shields are used when something needs protection. In the final moments of this argument, we must ask, what exactly is being protected, the idea of God or the human need for moral clarity? Perhaps the most disturbing possibility is that Satan exists not despite God, but because of him, not as a rival, but as a shadow. In psychology, the shadow represents the traits an individual refuses to acknowledge, yet cannot eliminate. The shadow does not disappear, it acts out. When projected outward, it becomes an enemy. When ignored, it grows. What if Satan is the projected shadow of divine perfection? The embodiment of everything God cannot openly express within a system that demands moral purity. Wrath, deception, destruction, these forces exist in sacred texts, often carried out directly by God. Yet over time, they're increasingly delegated. Responsibility shifts, blame relocates, Satan absorbs what God no longer wishes to own. This would explain why Satan's character evolves across history, from accuser to tempter to ultimate villain. He becomes the repository of divine darkness. And if that is true, then eliminating Satan would mean confronting something God and humanity may not be ready to face. So why does God allow Satan to act? Because removing Satan would collapse the structure that gives meaning to obedience, virtue, and salvation. Without an adversary, faith becomes compliance. Without temptation, morality becomes automation. Without evil, goodness loses contrast. This does not make evil good, but it makes it functional. And that realization is deeply unsettling. It suggests that the universe is not morally simple, but structurally complex. That God may not be a referee standing outside the game, but the architect of a system where opposition is essential. Satan, in this view, is not a mistake to be erased, but a role to be endured. Whether one believes this or not, the question lingers uncomfortably. If Satan disappeared tomorrow, would humanity become holy or meaningless? And perhaps that is the real reason the question has never been answered clearly. Because some questions, once fully answered, leave no one innocent.